welcome back. I got a bit busy with work, but here we are. It's October now, we're in the swing of things, and I have another Halloween memory from October Dreams. This one is called A Condemned Man by Steve Rasnick Tim. Back then, for me, it was all about masks. For Halloween, sure, but I'm also talking about day to day. This all started with the perception that people seldom said what they really felt about anything. I wasn't sure why, but apparently there was something impolite about frankness, and politeness was something we took pretty seriously in my part of the South. The only person I knew whose face invariably expressed whatever passed through his head was the town's... That's a problematic word. R-word fellow who sat on a bench by the drugstore when he wasn't out with his burlap sack collecting roadside treasures. Whether he was angry or happy or sad, you could always tell by the expression or expressions painting his face. And so as a child, I got the idea that that was one sign of brain damage. You lost your mask. I also came to believe that success or failure in life might be measured by how one handled one's mask. Steve McQueen, Robert Mitchum, they were born with wonderful masks, or maybe they grew them, I don't know for sure, but in any case, they handled them brilliantly. They appeared to have that coveted ability of controlling how other people felt about them because of their mask. I would have given anything for that. I had an extremely difficult time figuring out how other people saw me. It's still not one of my major talents, much less knowing how one might control that perception. No one I knew had that power, although a couple of the more popular kids had a taste of it. They knew a little about handling the mask, wearing the body, saying the right things, modulating the tone, revealing just the right amount of feeling and no more. They even seemed to know the rudiments of altering that mask to fit the circumstances. Fat kids, ugly kids, had the additional burden of a mask that rarely responded to what they wanted to project. Clearly, some masks were such that it was impossible to determine who was wearing them. So putting on a mask, I thought, was a wonderful thing. If I could have gotten away with it, I think I would have worn one all the time. I grew up in Southwest Virginia, at a place where Virginia elongates into a point. A friend of mine used to say it's where Virginia kicks Kentucky in the ass. One of the poorer counties in the country, so Halloween wasn't something you spent a lot of money on. I remember watching a Beverly Hillbillies episode in which the trick-or-treaters at one house were given plastic jack-o'-lanterns full of treats. I was astounded, calling my brothers in to see how they celebrate Halloween at rich people's homes. In our town, treats were cheap candy at best. At worst, hard pears from the last harvest of the year, from the trees in people's own yards. I broke a tooth or two before I learned better. You could buy a mask at the 5 and dime for $1 or so. I didn't see a full costume for sale in our town until I was almost out of high school. So every year, the challenge became picking a mask that you could cobble up a matching costume for, with little or no money. Of course, there were those universal costumes that kids with no money or time to spend on preparations have made for decades. Hobos and ghosts. My brothers and I were hobos 5 or 6 years running when we were little, carrying a stick with a kerchief full of rags tied on. My mother kept referring to it as a bindle stiff. I thought she was saying bend, little sniff, which I figured was the way two smelly hobos were supposed to greet each other. So all night long I was bending over and sniffing, which must have looked quite odd. Of course, since we were identical hobos every year, during that time we rarely strayed far from our street. Everyone knew exactly who we were. Hey Fred, it's them nice rainstick boys from down the street. Drop a cup of extra pears in their pokes. I'm from Appalachia. Being a ghost was spookier, and it was harder to figure out who was under the sheet. But when the sheet shifted, the eye holes didn't line up right, and you could kill yourself tripping down semi-rural streets with few lights. One year, my little brother insisted on wearing a sheet, which was particularly lame, since it had a big flowery border around the edges. But my other brother and I could not dissuade him. And had to take turns holding his hand so that he wouldn't get killed. In any case, my mother felt he was safer in white. We were never allowed to wear dark costumes at Halloween because of an apocryphal incident some 15 years before, when a 5-year-old dressed in solid black got away from his mother, ran out into the street, and was run over by a car. Certainly there isn't a lot to that story, but it creeped me out then, and it creeps me out now. In part, it is because the story was such a perfect container for my mother's obsessive worries and fears, and in part because of a Life magazine photo from those years, which I just could not get out of my head. A small shoe with a dirty sock lying on a dark highway, and nearby a woman on her knees on the pavement, her face split with the kind of grief I'd never imagined before. Southwest Virginia was rather isolated from the rest of the world at that time. Now I realize that we didn't have all that much, but at the time we certainly didn't feel poor, and it felt like we lived in the safest place on the planet. What we knew about the outside world came from Life and Look and National Geographic magazines, TV sitcoms, and the CBS Evening News. Douglas Edwards when I was small, then Walter Cronkite came along when I was just beginning to realize how big the world outside these mountains must be. The first national newscast I have memory of were only 15 minutes long. I remember my dad saying that it was a good length for a news program because that's about all the bad news a man can take in one day. The outside world seemed to be all about bad news. Which isn't to say that my friends were angels, of course. Halloween pranks could turn rather destructive, particularly out in the farm communities. Trees cut down to block the roads, furniture and equipment hung from telephone poles, farm wagons hauled up from on top of barn roofs. The exact mechanic of this particular prank seemed as mysterious as the building of the pyramids. Fields and brush set ablaze. Fewer parents allowed their kids to participate in trick-or-treating. Some years Halloween was practically shut down because of the pranking. But something the outside world did have was color and mystery, and a large number of people who had not known me all my life and would not recognize me behind a mask. The fact that a mask might work so much more effectively in that world was both exciting and terrifying. So at a certain point, I started spending painful hours sewing and constructing in an attempt to make decent Halloween costumes for myself. Costumes which in some twisted way reflected what I imagined the outside world would be like. A convict with hand-painted stripes and wounds, a two-headed snake whose narrow body was almost impossible to walk in, a succession of elaborate robots consisting of batteries and lights mounted to extremely uncomfortable cardboard boxes. Helpman, my brother was Help Boy, who, despite his name, was solely out there to cause trouble, and a variety of criminals and thieves. The best thing about all of these costumes, I thought, was that I did not feel compelled to speak with them on. Back then, even saying trick-or-treat to an adult or a stranger was extremely difficult for me. The last year I went trick-or-treating, I had no intentions of going. I don't remember exactly why. It wasn't as if I had better things to do with my time. It seemed the rest of the world was well into the 1960s, but as far as Southwest Virginia was concerned, it was still 55 or so. My dad still had his Chevy Bel Air from that year, and it didn't seem outdated in our little town. I still wore my hair in a flat top, having graduated up from a burr approximately 2 years previous. Although I had always thought of it as a brr because of Brer Rabbit's hair was real short on top, between his ears in the storybook I'd had since childhood. It's a wonder I ever learned English at all. My friends had stopped going out on Halloween the previous year, but I only saw my friends at school. My brothers were going, of course, but they were going to dress up as baseball players or something equally uninteresting. I was a big kid, and I knew that I was going to look weird out there begging for candy, and I would feel humiliated if anyone recognized me this year of all years. But something perverse in me suddenly wanted to go, at the last minute, a few hours before dark. It's an affliction I have to this day. Sometimes, when I'm convinced I'm going to have a terrible time at some event, it makes me want to go that much more. It was too late to think up anything special. I rummaged through my drawers and pulled out an old checked shirt some brown corduroys worn to the shade of attic dust. I didn't have a mask, and we were out of old sheets. I did find a foul, yellowing pillowcase on the floor of my closet. I cut 3 holes and slipped the thing on. It was too loose. The holes shifted around. I found a graying piece of cotton rope, and with an idiocy perhaps only another boy could appreciate, I used it to tie the pillowcase to my neck. Not too tightly, of course. After all, I was thinking, I'm not an idiot. Then I was complete, a combination of 2 old standbys, hobo and ghost. Just before I went out, I was looking at myself in the mirror and recognized where I'd seen this image before. In that Bible of the outside world, Life magazine. With the exception that my hood had holes, it looked like what the guest of honor at a lynching might wear. I knew these things still happened, or had recently happened, in parts of the South, a South I did not know. Despite that, however, I knew there were people in my county, people with ordinary-looking faces, normal masks, who were capable of much the same. Looking in the mirror creeped me out then, which made me think that, finally, this year, I had really succeeded with a costume. Just as I suspected, people were a little cold when I came to their door that year. A few even mumbled that it was a shame a big boy like me getting kids candy like that. Normally, comments like that would have sent me scurrying home, but it was obvious no one would recognize me. They didn't have a clue. I sang "Trick or Treat" sweetly, just like the little kids at each house, and even if they were unhappy about me coming, they still gave me candy. I wasn't sure why. I guessed it was just Southern hospitality at play. I used to think that if someone came to my grandfather's house to murder him, he'd first offer them some cold milk and biscuits. At one door, a woman asked me somewhat sourly, "So what are you supposed to be?" Without hesitation, I answered, "A condemned man." There followed a profoundly uncomfortable silence, as if she didn't know what to say to a statement like that. I've received that same reaction more than a few times over the years. Now, I didn't know I was going to say that. It just popped out. And as I thought about it, it didn't seem quite accurate. Certainly by the time you've got that hood over your head and the rope around your neck, you're at least one baby step past condemned. But I liked the sound of it, and used the phrase at least twice more that Halloween. And each time I was pretty sure the people at the door didn't know what the hell I was talking about, which, to tell the truth, was a fairly liberating thing. Then, toward the end of the night, I had the disorienting experience of passing by a mirror in someone's front yard. As I was approaching the steps, I passed myself coming away from the steps. Then I stopped and looked very closely, because of course there was no mirror. The other me had stopped as well to stare. I was terrified, my skin rippling with chill, a particular form of anxiety attack I was more than pleased to grow out of a few years later, although I certainly didn't think of it in those terms in my late adolescence. Back then, it was merely my skin trying to peel itself from the bow. The other me didn't say a word, but his fists were clenched as if he were ready to beat the mask off me. But then he ran, and I didn't see him again. Later, I would realize that although the checkered shirt was of a similar color, it wasn't exactly the same color, and I thought the pattern might have been different. The pillowcase hood looked much the same, but the rope was brown twine, I think, rather than my gray cotton. But he had been about my size and build, and it was simply amazing to me that anyone would have come up with that exact combination of a disguise. I wondered if he too had called himself a condemned man. I wondered if he had any better response from our neighbors behind their doors. And I wondered about what they must have been thinking, seeing 2 apparently identical boys too big for trick-or-treating, wearing such odd, vaguely disturbing outfits. Most importantly, I hadn't a clue who this fellow was behind the mask, and I never found out. Although we had to have gone to the same school. Hell, there only was one school, and I knew everybody, absolutely everybody in it, and I couldn't begin to guess who this could have been. It really creeped me out, and it creeps me out still. These next couple are pretty short, so I'll go ahead and read them as well. More Halloween memories. This one is by Gary Braunbeck. In 1974, when my little sister Gail was barely 4, she came down with a severe case of the flu on Halloween and couldn't go out trick-or-treating. Being the sensitive, compassionate, stand-up pearl of a human I am, even at 17 I was a little angel, I volunteered to go out and beg for her. I put on the most tattered clothes I could find, donned a ratty old dark wig of my mother's, pasted on some garishly long false fingernails and painted them black, then hastily and foolishly used black nail polish to make up my eyes in the same manner as Alice Cooper, circa the Killer days. I went out and begged on behalf of my sister and found that people were impressed with not only my selfless humanity, but my costume as well. Damn, but did I look good. As a result, I was given tons of extra treats to take back to my sister, who was overjoyed at the results. Then I discovered something. The glue I had used to attach the nails was of the super variety, so the nails weren't coming off anytime soon, nor was the black nail polish I'd used on my face. Scrub as I did, none of it was coming off. So I went to school the next day. This was a staunchly Catholic school in the early 70s, when Gestapo tactics were still employed by many of the teachers, and found that the nuns were none too pleased with my appearance. I was banished to a desk in the hallway for the remainder of the week, where I had to endure some of the most humiliating treatment from my fellow students during class changes. It was only toward the end of the day, right before school let out, that a bright spot appeared on my oh-so-bleak horizon. Father Metzger, the youngest priest at St. Francis, came strolling through the hall and caught sight of my terrible visage. "Hey, Alice," he said, giving me the thumbs-up sign. "Under my wheels kicks ass." And we both laughed. That was the day I discovered that God dug Halloween. It's been my favorite holiday ever since. This next one is by Jack Ketchum. When Halloween 1970 rolled around, I was 24 years old and still very much a hippie, and crashing with my friend John Wexo in sunny Laguna Beach, California. Remember crashing? I have notes on this, so it's easy to recall. That night, I got the notion that what we should do was to reverse the order of things trick-or-treat-wise. So Paula and John and I went out and bought fresh-cut flowers and salted mixed nuts, and bagged the nuts in plastic wrap along with thin-cut strips of typed paper. Remember typing? On which we'd written quotes from Camus and Abby Hoffman and Mark Twain and a bunch of other people, myself included. Sort of homemade fortune cookie type thing. Then we put on masks. Mine was a Dayglow skeleton, and went door to door, handing out the flowers and the nuts. Wouldn't accept a thing. We pretty much upset everybody one way or another. John is 6'2", and that sure didn't help any, but mostly we upset them in good ways. Most were smiling by the time we left, and some even seemed genuinely touched by the gesture. One old woman, whose husband almost closed the door on us when we first told them we were there to give him something, actually blessed us. Teachers goofed on the whole thing. Only one guy seemed really scared of us, and he was bigger than John. But the best thing was that on 3 occasions, children answered the door. Little kids, astounded by this weird adult departure from the rules, and delighted by it. One boy's eyes went wide as we handed him his flower and when he said thank you. And all the while he slowly closed the door, all 3 of us had the feeling that this little fellow was really thinking about it. Hard. That he'd probably ask questions. That maybe he'd remember it. We went home and drank hot, hard cider and listened to the song of the humpback whale. Haunting.